Chapter 4 of Homesick. The Hobbit fanfiction. Written by Margot_Kim. Read aloud by SkyAsimaru. If you enjoy this podfic, you can check out the original story on Archive of Our Own. If you would like to hear more of my recordings or see some of my own work, you can find me through the pen and screen name of SkyAsimaru. Homesick, Chapter 4. Bilbo woke as he always did on Sunday mornings, reluctantly.
Shouldn't have stayed up drinking with Bofa,
he thought to himself.
Shouldn't have stayed up late reading. Shouldn't have gone for that midnight walk. Whatever I did, shouldn't have done it.
He didn't think this literally, of course. The actual shape of his thoughts were closer akin to if a brain could pull the covers back up over itself. But the meaning was more or less the same. Sundays were always the hardest mornings to wake on, which was why he tried to wake Sunday afternoon instead. Bilbo burnt down more candles Saturday nights than any other night of the week. That was a night for finishing books and bottles of wine. He liked to stay up until Saturday evening blended into Sunday morning. Or maybe it wasn't so much that he liked doing it, as he couldn't bloody well avoid it. He had a nocturnal bent that night of the week. Living alone for so long will do that to you. It was why, amongst other reasons and causes, he never permanently shared a bedroom. Staggering in at 4 a.m. was always easier when there was no one waiting up for you. And when he'd wake at last, begrudgingly and only in deference to his stomach, that protested vehemently at the meals he'd slept through, he woke with a headache as well, not dissimilar to a hangover. Too much indulgence, whether alcohol or sleep, came back to bite you when the indulging was done. Pleasantly enough, the only cure Bilbo had ever discovered for too much sleep was a cup of tea and still more sleep. So, as Bilbo buried his face in his pillow, gathering his strength for the arduous task of standing up, he consoled himself with the thought that once he'd managed to shuffle himself to the kitchen and put on the kettle, he could grab whatever biscuits lingered from last week's groceries and collapse for breakfast into his favorite armchair, the one in the library that by now would be in the sunlight streaming in through the window that overlooked the garden. The sunlight would illuminate in soft gold light the books Bilbo might spend his afternoon reading, were it not a guarantee that he'd doze back off again the second breakfast was done. It was such a good chair for napping in, being so thoroughly tattered. Thorin never understood that. Thorin had fetched it for him. Or rather, he'd done the kingly thing and had someone else do the fetching. And heaven knew that Thorin understood the value of family heirlooms. But Thorin always regarded Bilbo's armchair like some poor, ugly mutt adopted out of charity. Sometimes Thorin would stand next to it and conspicuously talk about his great skill at furniture crafting, or repair, or maybe just reupholstering. And Bilbo would smile and say something like, "Isn't that handy?" And that would be the end of that. It had taken Bilbo 20 years to break in the headrest just so. He doubted even dwarven craft could replicate that determined labor of love. And anyway, not that he could say this to Thorin, it felt like home. Except there was something here that Bilbo's sleep-drunk brain couldn't quite puzzle out. Something was wrong. He knew that. He knew it must be obvious, but he couldn't figure out what. It should be said in Bilbo's defense that the above narration takes creative liberty with the actual shape of his thoughts as they were occurring at the moment. A more accurate transcription would read something like,
tea.
Something was wrong. What was wrong? Maybe he should sleep on it.
No!
He thought suddenly, and the ferocity of it jerked him a little closer to awake. Something was wrong, and it was something that was something enough that Bilbo couldn't get back to sleep until he'd unwound it.
Perhaps the library,
he thought, because that was what Bilbo did when he didn't know what to do. He went to the library and settled into his armchair. But his armchair was in his private quarters now. Thorin had offered to have it placed in Bilbo's special reading nook in Erebor's library. But the library was nearly a mile away from Bilbo's room, and that was too far. He sat in the chair when the homesickness struck, and when the homesickness stuck, he preferred to sit alone. Sometimes alone felt like home, too. There was no window in Bilbo's quarters. There couldn't be. The rooms were in the heart of a mountain. Sunlight warmed nothing down there. And Bilbo preferred Thorin's couch these days anyway. Well, Bilbo's couch, to be honest about it. But Bilbo wasn't about to admit that aloud where Thorin could hear and sulk about it. Because Bilbo's meager efforts on his armchair were one thing, but generations of Durins had beaten those couch cushions into submission. And maybe he'd walk to the library proper later, because exercise was important, and it was good to stay active, and all those things Owen had been telling. And most importantly, the kitchen was on the way to the library. And Bombur could always be counted on to leave a plate aside for him. But then again, maybe he wouldn't make it to the library after all, it being so far, and all Bilbo managing to have done since waking was rolling over so that his closed eyes faced where he needed to get up and go. But the sunlight was so bright this afternoon that his eyelids went orange as dragon fire. It made a body want to bury their face right back down again until the sun was gone and the window empty. Except there was no window in Bilbo's quarters. And the only time his rooms in Erebor smelled like dust and cotton and flowers was when Bilbo dreamt. And Bilbo was awake. He opened his eyes, and Bag End greeted him.
I dreamt it,
he thought, without a moment's hesitation or doubt.
I fell asleep with dwarf song in my ears, and I dreamt it all.
Bilbo tore himself to his feet.
Oh!
Then he found himself on the floor, the blanket he'd slept with for decades tangled around him as his legs refused to move as they ought.
I've been sick,
he thought, pulling himself forward on the floor to the door, and at the same time thinking,
don't let them have left without me.
The hallway was empty, and Bilbo propped himself against the wall to stand, his legs shaking underneath him as they had on Ravenhill when Thorin had fallen and Bilbo had thought. But he was here, and the dwarves would have just finished breakfast, and he could still catch up if only his legs would move. In the same hall he had taken his first steps. Bilbo lurched like a toddler past the bedrooms where the dwarves had sprawled, past the pantry they had devastated, and fell sideways into the dining room, tidy as if no one had been there at all. The dwarves wouldn't wait for him, their wagers and jokes notwithstanding, and Bilbo needed to pack. Bilbo needed to run. Bilbo needed to keep those idiots safe, because they sure as hell wouldn't do it themselves. Bilbo didn't so much walk into his entryway as crash, and as he was beginning to drag himself to the door, he had dragged himself through worse than this, the door swung open. "Mr. Baggins!" said a female hobbit Bilbo did not know, her arms full of food. "You're awake!" By the time she finished that sentence, it was no longer true. Bilbo woke. This time he made a better go of it. In the first minute of consciousness alone, he nearly opened his eyes and everything. "Come on now, Mr. Baggins," someone said from about 10 miles away. The voice belonged to a different world, one Bilbo had no part of. He couldn't even be sure it existed. The floppy wet thing that landed on his forehead with a soppy thwack, however, seemed firmly real. "Up and at 'em," said the voice, considerably closer than before. Bilbo cracked open an eye. A trickle of water ran into it. "You nearly made it to the door. You can give me a look at those eyes of yours." Bilbo opened his eyes. It was a little like working some window shades where a few of the important strings were broken, and he couldn't quite manage to get them open at the same time to the same degree. But they were open. After the film cleared from them, he was rewarded with the sight of a young woman peering down at him. "There we are." She reached over and readjusted the washcloth on his forehead. "Well done, Mr. Baggins." "Who are you?" Bilbo tried to ask. But the question had to jostle for a place on his tongue with other such pressing queries as, "Why are you in my house?" and "Why am I in my house?" and "Why are we both in my house as you scrub my face?" That last one was currently taking precedence. "Your fever's broke quick as it came," the hobbit said, as if she'd heard in Bilbo's mumblings at least one of the questions he'd been aiming for. "Good news for you, though I'm afeard you'll sweat yourself to death before you ever get to celebrate. I'll sponge you down." Bilbo appreciated the sentiment, as his increasing awareness of his body informed him that he was drenched. But that was almost never a sentence you wanted to hear from a complete stranger at your bedside. He licked his lips. They were so dry his tongue nearly stuck to them. "Who?" he managed. His voice sounded like a toad being squeezed to death. "Is he awake?" Another voice, a male one, and filled with more vigor than Bilbo thought he could handle at the moment. Bilbo turned his head to the doorway and saw his father staring back. Bilbo closed his eyes. When he opened them again, Bungo Baggins had walked forward to the foot of the bed, and in the process transformed into a young man, a stranger. "Calm yourself, Mr. Baggins," the woman said, which seemed an odd statement since whatever Bilbo's current problem was, he doubted it was too much energy. Then he saw her looking at the man at the end of the bed. the man who looked so much like Bilbo's own father. And something clunked into place. A Baggins.
Drogo?
Bilbo croaked. It was a blind guess. Drogo was, after all, the current caretaker and tenant of Bag End. Bilbo had never actually met the young man. He just knew that his mother had been fond of him when she'd gone off to visit the more distant members of her husband's family, and that Drogo was not Lobelia. When Bilbo had been in Erebor, trying to decide how to handle his property, that had been all the information Bilbo had needed.
He is awake!
Drogo yanked the hat off his head and held it to his chest with both hands. One hand was already occupied holding a fistful of weeds.
It's very good to see you awake, sir. We're chuffed to see you not dead and all, like we thought. And, it's very lovely to finally meet you, and thank you and whatnot for, leaving me your house and, all your belongings and all.
"Mr. Baggins," said the female hobbit in a measured tone that fairly screamed nurse. "Are those the herbs I sent you for?" Drogo looked down at the stems he clutched, completed with roots caked in showering dirt.
Yes, I think. Apothecary said they'd never heard of agrimonium before, but Mistress Marrowell said she had some in her garden I could take, as long as I help her out with weeding sometime this week. I don't know if I got enough, though, and I'll be happy to get more, of course, but it's just that she's got the biggest garden this side of the hill, and I don't know how much weeding I can...
"Very good," the woman said briskly. "That's plenty. It's a powerful herb." Bilbo, who knew exactly what agrimonia was, croaked.
"Poisonous."
The woman dabbed Bilbo's cheeks with the washcloth. Its cool touch felt blessedly good against his skin. That was how Bilbo figured out that he was flushed. "Yes, it's that too. But a pinch of it in your teas never killed anyone who wasn't dying already, and it's the only herb I've heard of that'll touch the heart of what's ailing you. And you've a strange, powerful illness indeed." She wiped down the back of his neck and then wrung the washcloth out into a basin on the bedside table. His washcloth, his basin, his bedside table. He'd known these objects all his life. When he settled in Erebor, they hadn't been worth the effort to transport. He'd had to content himself with missing them every minute of every day. Bilbo closed his eyes and tried to swallow with a throat that felt as dry as sand. After a moment, he heard a gentle, "Here we are, then," as a cup pressed against his lips. Water, blessed water, poured a dribble at a time into his mouth. He would have cried at the joy of it if he wasn't so covetous of his moisture right now. Bilbo didn't dare risk a drop. He drank a glass, and then another, while the woman alternatively stroked his hair and checked his pulse. She could have gutted him like a fish if she liked, so long as she didn't stop him from drinking. Towards the end of the second glass, Bilbo gagged. When she took the glass away, Bilbo managed to lift himself up a few inches, trying to follow it before he collapsed. "You'll need to take it easy," she said. "It's been a long while since you asked anything of your body. A good long while."
Gran always said, you only get to cheat death once. Best not to press your luck,
Drogo supplied helpfully, still wringing his hat and herbs like he was strangling someone. If Bilbo's mouth would just open properly, he'd tell Drogo that his Gran sorely underestimated how much you could cheat death. particularly in the company of dwarfs who courted it. The woman held out the water again and cupped his head up as he took another sip. When the glass was done, she let him go, and Bilbo flopped back down. Even swallowing was exhausting, but he felt better. The world felt a little sharper than it had before. His mind felt a little clearer, a little faster. His mouth very nearly worked. "Ow," Bilbo said. It came out as "ow," which was also an accurate enough statement of his general condition. He swallowed and tried again. "How am I here?" Drogo and the woman looked at each other. Drogo nearly twisted his hat clean in half. The woman turned back to Bilbo and picked up the washcloth again. "We were rather hoping you could tell us that." The woman's name was Primula Brandybuck. She was 7 years shy of majority, though you wouldn't know it unless she said. She seemed like the kind of hobbit who'd been born middle-aged, with her hair pulled back into a sensible bun. When her mother fell sick, Primula had nursed her back to health. When her father fell sick, Primula nursed him onward to death. Both tasks she took to with such easy aplomb that Mrs. Brownfoot, midwife for half the shire, only by the dint of the other half being unfortunately male, took the young Primula under her wing, and there Primula had stayed for the last decade. The family had money, of course. There was no need for any daughter of the Brandybucks to hold something as utilitarian as a job. But nursing suited Primula's temperament. Primula was a thistle that had been mistakenly named after a flower. For the sake of family pride, the Brandybucks had convinced everyone that Primula was simply volunteering her time. A perfectly respectable pastime for a better-off hobbit lass. It was only gauche if she actually made money. As a result, Primula had learned how to stand still and smile softly, until someone finally fetched her payment. She was very good at waiting. Her hobbies included knitting and regarding you carefully over the top of her reading glasses. Bilbo learned very little of this over his first days of consciousness. At least, he didn't learn the explicit words. He managed to feel them nonetheless. It was the way one doesn't need to open a sack to get the shape of what's inside it. Instead, what Bilbo started to learn in a story doled out in the moments between sleep and sleep was this. 2 weeks ago, Pippa Bracegirdle came into the tavern of the Woolly Foot, knocked back a cup of ale, and announced to everyone in there, about half a dozen gadders at that time in the early afternoon, that her poor nerves were jangled near to death from the horrible sight she'd just seen in her pumpkin patch.
What's that then?"
The tavern keeper, whose name was Octavio, and who would repeat a slightly more lurid version of this story to every customer he saw that day, and until the day he died, asked lazily. Pippa would say nothing until she'd had another drink. Her nerves, you see, her poor, poor nerves, and so on, until Octavio slid another glass her way, just to shut her up. She drowned with the verve of a far nervier woman and exclaimed, "I've a dead hobbit in my pumpkin patch!" Octavio and the half-dozen miscreants in the tavern that day all agreed that Pippa buried the lead. Within 10 minutes, about half the town milled anxiously on the other side of Pippa's fence as Constable Robin Lightfoot, a nice lad, good family, a bit thick, regretted his choice of profession and picked up a stick. He said to the prone body lying 5 feet in front of him, its arms folded across its chest like someone had prepped it for burial, but forgot to stick it in the hole.
Can you hear me then, sir? Can you hear me?
The body said nothing, which seemed like a good argument that it was, in fact, a body. Robin guessed, at least. He had never actually seen one of those before. Robin looked down at the stick he'd picked up. From the fence behind him, his gaffer shouted, in the time-honored tradition of figuring out the dead from the dead drunk,
Give him a good poke, lad!
After the 5th good thump, Robin shouted back to the crowd,
I swear he's really dead. I ain't even twitched.
Then either drag him out of the garden or chuck him over towards the watercress, where he might do us some good.
Pippa's sister shouted back from her perch on the fence.
The soil's rubbish over there. You're not using a stranger's dead body to fertilize my garden, Lobelia,
Pippa protested.
Why not? Well, for one, it's my bloody garden.
No one's fertilizing their garden,
Robin said, in what he hoped was a very constabulary voice.
My sister can fertilize her garden if she wants to fertilize her garden,
Lobelia snapped back.
Bella, I am not eating any watercress what grew out of a dead hobbit. You don't have to, Lobelia said, but you should be able to if you want.
We're finding out who this is,
Robin shouted desperately,
so we can give him over to his loved ones so they can bury him.
Lobelia gave Robin a look that made a man, maybe, sort of, in his heart of hearts, think about pushing her into a mud puddle with the stick he'd just used to check the vivacity of some bloke in a pumpkin patch.
Then go check the body.
Robin froze.
Check the
body, she finished, when Robin could not bring himself to. Robin looked back down at the stick in his hands. Maybe if he gave the body another thwack, something identifiable would pop out. A bit like a piñata, maybe. Seemed better than actually touching the body longer than a few seconds. Having never seen a dead body before, Robin had also never properly felt one before either. And he saw no reason to break that streak.
Oh, just search him already,
Lobelia heckled.
You search him,
Robin snapped back. Which, as it turned out, was a mistake. Lobelia Sackville Baggins was many things, but she was not squeamish.
Oi, Robin, did you appoint yourself a new deputy?
Someone on the sidelines heckled as Lobelia shoved the hapless constable aside.
Oh, shove it,
Robin muttered, but without much conviction, distracted because Lobelia had frozen a foot in front of him. Robin didn't follow her line of sight. Anything that made a woman like that freeze would probably kill Robin if he looked straight at it. He'd managed to go all this time only looking at the body through the corner of his eyes. Lobelia brought her hands, still tucked in their neat white gloves, to her face. Robin thought for a moment she might be crying. She took 2 halting steps forward until the body lay right against the plates of her feet. The crowd, once raucous behind her, was silent as she knelt. One hand left her mouth and went to rest haltingly, as if she had rediscovered fear on the body's chest, right above the heart.
Do you know him?
Robin asked gently. He watched Lobelia's shoulders rise and fall, and then she nodded.
Oh, I'm sorry.
He didn't know what else to say. The constabulary training had consisted almost entirely of where he was supposed to hang his truncheon so it didn't make his trousers fall down, and how to get free drinks without looking like you were angling for them.
Are you all right?
He hazarded, which seemed stupid the second it left his mouth. Lobelia stood, her face perfectly dry.
I'm better than all right,
she said.
I'm the new owner of Bag
End. You should have seen your funeral,
Drogo said as Primula came back from the kitchen with a bowl of broth. The smell made Bilbo nauseated and ravenous.
You never saw such a fuss.
Flowers, crepe, draperies, music, Primula said. It had the makings of a good party, all things considered.
I hope my corpse didn't get in the way of a good time, Bilbo said dryly.
Dryly in a more literal sense than usual. He couldn't remember ever being this thirsty. He drank till he burst, and then he drank some more. Primula said that was good. That meant his body was getting back to something close to how bodies ought to behave. She was right, even if sleeping and endlessly sleeping was infinitely more pleasant than forcing himself to stay awake. Even the minute act of swallowing exhausted him. But he was doing better. It was 3 days since he met Primula and Drogo, and today was the first day he'd managed to stay awake for more than 20 minutes.
We were mourning good and proper, don't you worry, Drogo said. It wasn't until we found out that you weren't dead that everything started getting improper.
Bilbo's eyes followed Primula's hands as she stirred the broth. Steam rose from it like a shimmering mirage.
You still haven't told me about how I went from being a corpse to a patient.
That's my fault, I'm glad to say, Primula said. Bilbo tried to stare at Primula in surprise, but his gaze was still caught in the soup's gravitational pull. It's true. That's why your cousin hired me to watch over you. Lobelia had you up on a fancy beer.
It was a good beer,
Drogo said. It was a good beer, and I imagine she'll use it for many funerals to come. Primula kept stirring the broth. Bilbo tried very hard not to drool. So, everyone who's supposed to talk talks. We're crying into our handkerchiefs. It's all quite affecting. And then afterwards there's the bit where you walk past the body and have yourself a good look, which is what you came to the funeral for in the first place.
Bilbo snorted. Yes, the Hobbit way. One last peek at the neighbour while they're not looking.
We die as we live, and I was in line to see you like the rest of the Shire, because you'd gone off to foreign parts, hadn't you? I thought you might look terribly exciting. Bilbo, with a bit more effort than he was anticipating it would take, raised his perfectly unexciting arms.
Sorry to disappoint.
Primula smiled, a little smile, a bit like a slice of winter sun. Disappoint? You were the first corpse I've ever seen that wrinkled his nose when I paid respects. I called the rector over and said, I think there's something off about this body. We put a little mirror over your mouth. After a moment, the mirror fogged up. And long story short, here you are. There was, Bilbo would learn when Drogo and Primula thought him sufficiently recovered, a little bit more to the story than that. There was the screaming, for one. Resurrection sounds nice, but even if you wish Grandma was alive again, you don't generally want to see her climb up out of the grave. And hobbits are a superstitious lot, though to be fair to them, their superstitions aren't unfounded. Bilbo has been from one end of the world to the other, and he can attest that there's more horrors of more kinds than he'd ever dreamed. You take what luck you can get. Bombur spent the journey yelling at Bilbo for stealing pinches of salt to throw over his shoulder. Anyway, the point was that things had been touch and go for a bit. But Drogo managed to stop anyone at the funeral from torching Bilbo's body. Quite a few attendees had been keen on a pyre. Bilbo had, after all, been to foreign parts, and he'd returned under the most mysterious of circumstances. Who knew what horrific diseases they had out there in the big world? Might be anything. You hear about them boys who went off to the woods and came back with a wolf living in their skins. It really happened. McGaffer told me about it himself after he heard it down at the pub. Or maybe he's been magicked. Left with a wizard, didn't he? And with a mother like his, what did you expect? And how did he get back anyway? And in Lobelia's childhood pumpkin patch. You know he never liked her. Left his home to a perfect stranger rather than let her have it. Maybe he gets himself infected with some kind of foreign disease. Maybe he gets himself all changed up by a wizard. And he thinks to himself, well, I'm going to die, aren't I? And maybe he thinks to himself, but I never did like Lobelia, did I? That's what I'd do, isn't it, if I got myself made dangerous in foreign parts and I had someone I didn't like, and if I would do it, then anyone would. They'd got as far as stacking the wood when Drogo managed to drag them off with convivial good charm and a promise of a round of drinks at the pub to celebrate his cousin's unexpected recovery. Well, it was more like Drogo and his promise of an ale for everyone who put down the kindling right now. And he meant right now. And he was looking at you, Mrs. Grubb, for shame.
We got the excitement we wanted,
Primula said wryly, sharing a look with Drogo, who inexplicably blushed a little.
I think that was the most lively funeral round here since Farmer Boffin's widow fist-fought the Diggle lass, who gave too sweet a eulogy.
Bilbo frowned. I don't remember that one.
It was 3 years ago. It was a very flattering eulogy for a bloke who is a bit of a miserable bastard. Widow Boffin figured that meant they must have been in love,
Drogo said.
I guess that wasn't in any of the letters you got from home. Probably more important things to write about, eh?
As it happened, in the 5 years that Bilbo had lived at Erebor, he'd received precisely 7 letters from the Shire. 4 were related to the task of getting all of his belongings from here to there. 2 had been from Drogo, first accepting his new position of executor of Bilbo's property, and then a follow-up about what exactly it was that Bilbo wanted to do. The last letter was from Lobelia. Beaufort had done a dramatic reading of it at dinner, and the table concluded that never had they read such an articulate and impassioned declaration of war. Bilbo settled back into his pillows. It wasn't easy. Primula had been clear that he had to start spending more and more time upright to rebuild some of the muscles he'd lost. And so she'd taken to stacking the pillows behind him with such verve that Bilbo wasn't so much sitting up as leaning slightly forward as his mother's throes tried to smother him from behind.
I'm curious. I can understand Lobelia celebrating my death in general, Bilbo said. But she of all people should know that she wouldn't get Bag End if I died.
Well, she knew that when you die, all rights to Bag End pass to Mr. Baggins.
Primula nodded at Drogo.
The other Mr. Baggins.
Mr. Drogo,
Drogo offered.
Mr. Drogo, then. And I imagine she expected she could convince Mr. Drogo to sell.
I would, too, Drogo said, without an ounce of sheepishness. Lobelia scares the fur of my feet. It's good I'm not dead, then, Bilbo muttered. Drogo patted Bilbo on the knee with the cautious reserve of a man who wasn't used to touching sick people. We're glad you're not dead too. It's been right pleasant sitting and chatting with you these days. When you're awake and not lying there like maybe we should have put you in the ground. Except it's good we didn't, not wanting to bury you alive and all.
Bilbo wasn't quite sure what to say to that, except,
Yes, Will. Thank you.
I think at last the broth is cooled, Primula said, lifting the bowl. Bilbo sat up instantly. Open? She said. Bilbo's mouth opened so quick it felt like his jaw was clanking down. The broth hit his tongue like it was the first taste he had ever known. It was euphoric, until it was not. Luckily, depending on your definition of luck, Bilbo had nothing but water in his stomach when he started to gag. Luckier still, see previous notation. Primula was fast with a bucket. She had it under his mouth before the first heave.
Well, we might have been overambitious trying to put food in you this early, she said, rubbing Bilbo's back. But we'll get there.
Bilbo spat in the bucket in response. When we tell stories, there are two important parts: the bits we put in and the bits we leave out. Take, for example, the illness.
What illness?
Bilbo had asked Primula as she tipped her agrimonia tea into his mouth that first day of true consciousness.
One I've never seen outside of books, Primula said. Drink your tea, Mr. Baggins.
Take, for example, how Bilbo's new ability to imbibe drink implied a corollary. Implied Primula coming over with a bedpan, and the grace nurses have when they sense their patient's shame.
This is good, she told him. This is what bodies do. Take in, let out. This is you getting better.
That was fine enough for the person bringing the bedpan to say. The person using it always has a different perspective. Then let's admit we have eluded certain details. But illness leaves the sufferer with little enough privacy, and some details have no place in decent stories. After all, when Bilbo sat down to write the tale of the journey, he had the good sense to tactfully omit the rampant dysentery and pissing on trees. The dwarves might chronicle that bit if they chose, and they might very well choose to do just that, being a far less squeamish race. But it certainly wasn't a Hobbit detail. There is no such thing as the whole story. There are only stories and the sense we make of the gaps in between them.
Thorin,
Bilbo had whispered, through lips cracked from fever.
Where are you, Thorin?
He's coming,
Primula lied as she washed his face. She hadn't the faintest idea who Thorin was, or even if that was the word Bilbo was saying, the fever slurring his words together into little more than a moan. But she said he's coming nonetheless, because from the moment she had opened the door to Bag End to see Bilbo prone on the entryway floor, she had known that he was dying. Illness is like that sometimes. Recovery doing little more than to knock someone from a stable plateau to a downwards spiral.
Thorin's on his way,
Primula said. because sometimes all a patient needed was to hold on for 1 more hour. Bilbo held on 1 more hour, and then the next, and then the next, as Primula sat up beside him in the night and waited to see if she'd see die the same hobbit she saw come back to life.
If I'm here, he's here,
Bilbo kept saying to Primula as she tried to remember what Mrs. Brownfoot had always advised about the weird illnesses.
He must be here. Where is he? Where?
Bilbo didn't so much cough as rasp, the desert of his throat surrendering.
They're the same as the normal ones, except you feel fancy about curing 'em. Don't lose your common sense, lass.
Yes, that was the advice Primula needed to remember. Mr. Baggins was recovering from a fever. Primula would start there. "We don't know," Primula said, glancing at Drogo, who clutched the rest of his freshly picked agrimonia. He looked back at her helplessly and like he wished to be elsewhere. But he would stay if she needed him. He was a good lad. Primula thought nothing odd whatsoever about describing a man 12 years older than her as a lad. Next to him, she felt quite the Marmish matron.
"Why don't we tell you what we know?"
Primula said calmly as she took Bilbo's pulse, his wrist clammy under her fingers.
"And we'll see if it jogs anything for you."
And as she kept a close eye on him, as she helped him take his baby steps back from death's door, she started with Drogo's help, telling a story that opened something more or less like,
2 weeks ago, Pippa Gracegirdle came into the tavern of the Woolly Foot, knocked back a cup of ale, and announced to everyone in there, about 6 gadders at that time in the early afternoon, that her poor nerves were jangled near to death from a horrible sight she'd just seen in her pumpkin patch.
But I need to find Thorin,"
Bilbo would protest, and Primula would go,
"Shush! We haven't even told you how Robin started beating you with a stick to see if you were dead."
And she pulled up his shirt.
"Look,"
Primula said, pointing to a mottled bruise underneath Bilbo's ribs that he hadn't noticed. It had blended in among the rest of the general ache. Even in his delirium, Bilbo had enough to his senses to be offended.
"From what I hear,"
Primula added at his indignant spluttering,
"a few spectators were very sceptical about you being dead."
"So what? He beat me until they had an answer either way?"
"Well, yes."
By the time they got up to telling the funeral, Primula thought Bilbo might live. It never occurred to Bilbo that he wouldn't, and it would be quite a long while before Primula told him how close he had come. As he came out of the long days and nights of that first week, he grew further and further from the idea of his own death, until it was with great difficulty that he remembered how very long he had been ill.
"Thorin must have done something,"
he told Primula, to keep his mind off the bowl she stirred. They were trying the broth again for the 4th time. Bilbo was salivating and dry-heaving already.
"I must not have been able to be cured at Erebor, so he brought me here."
"That makes sense,"
Primula said. Bilbo pulled his father's housecoat tighter around himself.
"Then where is he now?"
Primula offered him nothing in response except a spoonful of broth. This time he kept it down. How to describe the inescapable drumbeat of Thorin's name in Bilbo's head, as constant as the beat of Bilbo's own heart? Well, that description will do for a start. But Bilbo had never been able to capture the rhythm of Thorin in his thoughts, the way he took center stage at the strangest of moments, the way he suffused himself through Bilbo, that every thought was colored by him. In Bilbo's mind, Thorin was more a scent than a figure, wafting through even Bilbo's memories that the actual Thorin had no part of. Bilbo's childhood on the hills around Bag End seemed to have Thorin sitting in the garden watching him. Bilbo's sleepless nights after his parents' deaths seemed to have Thorin lying on the other side of the bed. Bilbo had spent 5.5 years trying to write a good love poem for Thorin. Thus far, all he had was, "You're there. You're always there." Therefore, 9 days after Bilbo awoke to find himself returned to his family home, he was relieved but not in the least surprised when Drogo burst into the bedroom as Primula finished up lunch and said excitedly,
"There's a dwarf in the parlour. He says it's a king."
Why would Bilbo be surprised? These days he lived his life expecting Thorin to be there wherever he turned. Bilbo sat up in bed, tried not to black out from the sudden movement, and said,
"Bring me to him."
"Perhaps we ought to bring him to you," Primula said. Bilbo shook his head and immediately remembered the whole thing about avoiding sudden movement in the name of not fainting.
No, I need to go to him."
Primula opened her mouth to protest, but Drogo got there first.
"I'll carry you there,"
he said, and he scooped Bilbo out of the bed and up into his arms. That hadn't been exactly what Bilbo was expecting, but Drogo was fleet of feet and strong of arm, while Bilbo sometimes couldn't roll himself over in bed without wanting to throw up on the floor. So Bilbo settled into his second cousin's arms, as Primula said,
"By Eru, at least don't drop him."
Drogo carried Bilbo down the hallway, muttering,
"A king in my own kinsman's house! Bless me, I say!"
Bilbo patted down his hair and silently thanked Primula for fussing so diligently over his hygiene.
"Put me down here,"
Bilbo hissed, as Drogo halted just outside the parlor. Primula was ready at Bilbo's elbow as he put his feet on the ground. It was the first time he'd been out of bed since he'd woke in that horrible panic. They shook underneath him. Bilbo couldn't say if it was from weakness or excitement.
"Lean on me,"
Primula said, as Bilbo's knees started to buckle.
"I'll help you walk in."
"Me too."
Drogo hooked his arm through Bilbo's without waiting for a response. On his other side, Bilbo took Primula's proffered arm and nodded appreciatively. He could do little else. Just standing took all his will. But Thorin was in the parlor. Thorin was waiting for him. Thorin would see Bilbo walking in, even if it was on trembling legs supported by 2 other hobbits. And he would know that all was well. If that wasn't worth walking for, nothing was. He took his first step, Primula and Drogo walking with him, and he took his next and the next, and then he stood in the entryway to the parlor. A familiar back faced him, the arms clasped together in front. The long black hair was plaited back into the elaborate braids Bilbo had learned symbolized royalty abroad from their kingdom. The clothes were the familiar wear of the road. One item in particular, a long blue tunic battered by the elements that nonetheless spoke of grace, brought tears to Bilbo's eyes. Nostalgia swept over Bilbo, powerful and potent as that first sip of broth. Thorin had not dressed so since the journey. He'd had no need to, as king. Bilbo pushed himself free of Primula and Drogo. He felt quite capable of standing on his own now.
Say something clever. Smile at him and say something clever.
But all he could think was,
"You're always there."
Bilbo's mouth was still frozen, half open, waiting for words, when the dwarf turned. "My dear Mr. Baggins, so good to see you're feeling better," said Dees, a gleaming battle-axe ready in her hand. "Would you kindly tell me where my two-faced oath-breaker of a brother is?"
"It's the bloody beards,"
Bilbo thought.
"You can never tell one dwarf from the other with all that mess on their face."
He might have said something of the sort aloud if he hadn't been in the process of fainting. To be continued in Chapter 5.
Thank you for reading.
Please drop by the archive
and let the author know what you thought of their work.